ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming this evening. A beautiful summer evening.
Sure is.
So thanks for taking time out. Our speaker tonight needs no introduction. He's Eugene DiOrio. And his topic, which he'll explain in a moment, has to do with his trips to Savannah and Charleston and the ties that the Huston family has to those areas. They are lovely areas. And this is the last lecture of the months up until June. We've had a busy lecture season with Rebecca Lucan's birthday and Black History Month and Women's History Month, and also our Rebecca Lucan's Award, and then Bob Ford gave a talk on World War I. So thank you all for coming. Without further ado, Gene.
Well, thank you, Jim. Good evening, everyone. And a pleasure to see so many of you here once again. And yes, we are going to be focusing on two wonderful cities, Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. And I'm also going to throw in a few other places as we do it. But both cities are quite wonderful. They are historic, and they have vast attractions in terms of history and architecture. And both cities are prime examples of the wisdom of historic preservation. Both cities years ago began to work on preserving them. I think Charleston and New Orleans were two of the first that really created historic districts. That has worked out. Today they are high tourist attractions. So tonight I'm going to show pictures I took a number of years ago of both cities. My growing age, I don't travel much anymore, so most of my pictures are sort of old. Savannah has a particular importance to us locally with the Huston family. And that is because, can you see the pictures behind me? This gentleman, Charles Lucans Huston, Sr., married this lady, Anna Stewart, in Savannah.
You know, he never used the word senior.
He what?
He never used the word senior.
Well, I did.
No, you did.
To distinguish him from your dad, who was junior, of course.
He did that.
But he married, and this began the whole Savannah attraction. Now, their son, Stuart Huston, took the name Stewart from his mother's family, who was Annie Stewart. The Stewarts were well established in Savannah. Her father, Colonel Stewart, was a Civil War colonel and also was in the cotton business, which was a big thing in the South. They were related to, he had a brother, the father had a brother, Roger Stewart, who lived in Mobile, Alabama, also made a fortune in the cotton. Stuart Huston, the son, became enormously fond of Savannah and spent a lot of time there visiting his family. And of course, he eventually married a lady from Savannah, Harriet Huston. They both had lost their first spouses. Stuart lost his first wife. She lost her first husband, Harriet. But they met socially, and they were together there. And Stuart became so enchanted with Savannah, he chose to be buried there. He's buried in the cemetery there. Stuart's great charity, which he formed, the Stuart Huston Charitable Trust, has been instrumental in helping various agencies in Savannah. And Mrs. Huston's two sons from her previous marriage served on the board of trustees of the Stuart Huston Charitable Trust. And now one of her nephews is on. So there's a very definite connection between the Huston family and Savannah, which adds to our local interest. So without further ado, I think I'll start the pictures. Okay. Am I okay standing here? Now, of course, I went down by train. I don't like to drive that far, and I don't care to fly, so I went down by train on the, what is the seaboard coastline. A rather quiet trip. The Florida landscape's not all that exciting. But the railroads, there were once two great railroads that served the South, the Seaboard Airline and the Atlantic Coastline. And eventually they merged, one of the earlier railroad mergers, and formed the seaboard coastline. And so I rode that down to the south. This was, Amtrak had already gotten started, but the Amtrak was still using other logos from the previous railroads. Took a while to wipe all that out. It was a pleasant trip. It was overnight, I believe, and then I've forgotten. Of course, the schedules are different now. This was the logo for the seaboard coastline, and delightful porter. For those of us who travel by train, love it. Porters were always important people. And of course, yours truly, standing on the steps. A young friend of mine looked at this picture. He said, "My God, you mean you wore a suit on a train?" I said, "Yes, in those days we did. Now you travel in jeans and sweatsuits." Anyway, we're in Savannah. Now, when I look at a town, I always like to figure out what made it tick. And the major thing in Savannah was the river. This is the Savannah River. I think it's about 12 miles from the sea. And very early on, this was an important economic factor for the city. Still is today. A dredge and so forth. Now, the history of this goes back to the time of King George II, who was going to give this territory to the Carolinas and deeded it to them, I believe, or arranged for them to have it. But then they didn't want it. They were afraid of the Spanish coming up from Florida. And so it was taken in to someone else. The big name that you run into constantly in Savannah is Oglethorpe, who was a member of Parliament and who was very interested in the welfare of debtors. And he had the idea of establishing a colony which would help people in that sort of need. He was very definitely an altruistic figure. So the king transferred the land to him, and he put together a group of trustees and came over, and in 1732 they sailed, and in 1733 they established the town. Now, there are some rather interesting historical notes that indicate that Oglethorpe thought this was a great place for a town. It was a high bluff, there was the river, and so this is what he did. He is the founder. And like Penn in Pennsylvania, I think Oglethorpe is hands down Georgia's most famous colonial figure. An old sailing vessel that was mirrored along there. And Oglethorpe, when he started the town, did it by dividing it into wards and then creating squares. Originally, this was for defense. Each ward would have a square, and if there was some attack, the people who lived on the outskirts could come with their families and their cattle in these squares. That continued for until the mid-19th century. As Savannah grew, they developed more and more of these squares, which today are very much a hallmark of the city. Now, starting with the river area, this is what is known as Factor's Walk. When Eli Whitney developed the cotton gin, and the cotton became everything in the South, this became one of the chief ports, as did Mobile, Alabama. And factors or agents who sold the cotton all grouped in this area. And there are these pits where the cotton was stored for shipment and where the factors dealt. Today, this is a tourist attraction. They've preserved most of these buildings. This, I believe, is the Chamber of Commerce. And an interesting statue in front. I'm not sure whether it's a dragon or a horse or a lion, but there it is, and I love the vegetation. Factor's Walk is really a major thing. I walked up and down it several times. And again, you have to know what makes a city tick in terms of economics. Cotton went from a few thousand bales to millions of bales that were shipped mostly to Britain. This is a must-see if you spend time in Savannah to see the Cotton Walk. Now, a lot of these buildings behind it are now apartments, offices, restaurants, and so forth. Yes, the flag is flying. I was there after the war. And there we are. It's wonderful that Savannah did preserve these walks because they are indication of the city's economic development. This is the back of them, which, as you can see, are quite high on the riverside. Lovely walks along this area. Oh, come in. Come in. Please come in. Good evening. Good evening. Come right in. Good to see you. At the upper end, in fact, the walk, there's an area that has been developed by the local gas company, and there's their office building. The trustees kept an area here which they developed as gardens, and they called it the Trustees' Gardens at one time. Savannah City Hall is located in this part of the city. And one of the major business streets very close to the river. I watched this building being demolished. I didn't think they tore anything down in Savannah, but this was coming down. And I don't know what the building was. Well, near the Trustees' Garden is this old building called the Pirates and the Pirate House. And I'm told it actually had a history of pirate, and that Treasure Island, the famous novel, mentions it. And of course, it became a very popular restaurant. I remember going to dinner there. Something of a tourist attraction, but a fun place to go. Not far from the river at all. The stories are that in the 19th century, it wasn't unusual for guys to get drunk and get carried out and shanghaied and put on ships. There's a lot of stories about it. Well, as I hiked about the city, I was really fascinated with the architecture. The old buildings, the colors, the charms, the growth. One of the prominent buildings is the Telfair Museum. Now, it was the Telfair family. The front part of it was a private dwelling, but later on it was expanded into a museum behind it. And it is operated as one of the several museums in Charleston. The statues, I understand, are all quite old. As the Telfair was developed, they kept some of the rooms, or restored some of the rooms as it had been. An old church very close by. Now, you hear a great deal in Savannah about Juliet Gordon Low, who founded the Girl Scouts. This was the house in which she was born, which is a museum, and which I believe is owned by the Girl Scouts, and it's preserved as a national history. Quite a handsome classic house, prominent family. Then this is one of the best known houses. It's called the Owen Thomas House. The original builder had a distant relative through marriage, a young architect in Bath, England, named William Jay. And he had him design this house, start the design before he actually came to Savannah. The house was later owned by a family named Owens and a descendant by the name of Thomas, who gave the house to the Savannah Historical Group. I think Telfair actually owns the property. It's one of the best known houses in the South. And I remember going through it. It was a not to be missed property. Sort of English Regency style, with this handsome front porch. What I loved about Savannah was the textures, the colors, the stucco. I took that from the front porch one afternoon, and late shadows developing. A great deal of beautiful ironwork in these properties. The orange stucco. And to the side of the house is this cast iron porch, which is really quite interesting. Note the supports that look like leaves. In 1825, a very distinguished visitor, the Marquis de Lafayette, came back to the United States, toured the country, went to Savannah. And he lived in this house while he was in Savannah, and he addressed the public from that staircase there. I read that they had a duplicate staircase or porch made with the idea of putting it on the other side of the house, and unfortunately it was lost in a shipwreck, so it never got to Savannah. But this is a prominent feature of it. Now, these are some slides I purchased. The inside of the Owen Tower has this rather interesting staircase. It divides between columns and then rises to the second floor as a double fit. The parlor is quite interesting. If you notice the curved around the ceiling, it was designed to make it look round, but actually it's just sort of chased in. The house is preserved as a historic house museum with a great deal of period furniture. There's another view of the parlor and the dining room. I always seem to gravitate to dining rooms and libraries when I look at historic houses. And this dining room was quite lovely, the fittings, the furnitures. And I took that just looking out one of the windows. A lovely garden to the back, which has been nicely restored. After I came back from this trip, I showed the pictures one evening at Terracina. And Mrs. Stewart Houston had a guest who said that she had lived in this house right behind the house there. Well, one of the houses that's another don't miss, must see is the Davenport House, built I think in the early 1800s, a rather handsome Georgian colonial. And incidentally, Georgian fits very well to the architecture. Very British, very much inspired by Georgian England. This house, I understand, became something of a tenement, came close to being demolished. But as Savannah was realizing the importance of its architecture, a group of people got together, they bought it, and eventually established this historic Savannah organization, who moved into it and became their headquarters, and they handsomely restored this house. I'd say this is another not to be missed property in Savannah. I was fascinated also with some of the lesser buildings. This is, I'd say, mid-1860s, very Italian with a cowboy, and fascinated by all this ironwork, most of which was probably made in the north. But meandering around the city one day, I saw this house and photographed it. I imagine that ironwork is not safe to stand on those porches, but it's very delicate and very beautiful. Of course, it was produced in enormous batches by mills in the north, much of it in Philadelphia, I believe. But again, as I walked around the city, looked at the buildings, shadows, light, textures, and this was the Savannah Civic Center, which was under construction at the time that I was there. Now, one moment while I change the reel.
Have you been back there recently?
No, I have not. To my regret, but I haven't been.
Was that the early 70s when you were there?
Mid-70s, yes. Mm-hmm. Again, the vegetation is fascinating, and it adds to the color of the area. Another, I don't know what all the buildings were. I walked around and photographed them. This, I think, is called the Champion House. There was some talk of it becoming a museum. I don't know if it ever has. One of the many lovely churches that are there. This church, I think, was the First Presbyterian. And Woodrow Wilson, President Woodrow Wilson's first marriage, he was married here the first time for here. Lovely, lovely spire. And I tried to get some of these films, these pictures with a border of pictures of growth. Chippewa Square, one of the many squares. And here's a statue of the great man himself, Oglethorpe, who is, as I say, Georgia's equivalent of William Penn, the great man of the colony and the founder. He went back to England Not long after he founded it, I really don't know if he ever came back or not, but he's definitely the founder and the great man. Now, in one part of the city, there's a cemetery. It's called the Colonial Square, with a lot of very, very ancient graves. I don't think it's a cemetery still being used, but it was quite a fun place to go and look around these old graves. As I remember, it was, maybe 4 or 5 blocks down from the river, but definitely the older part of the city. And of course, the great oak trees and the hanging Spanish moss is always an attraction. Another beautiful church spire. Now, this is another very interesting house. It's called the Melgren Green House. It was built by a wealthy person. Later became the parish house for the Episcopal Church there. The interior, which unfortunately I don't have any slides, is fantastically beautiful with the Gothic plasterwork. It is Gothic style. And in that great time when General Sherman marched into Savannah, he stayed here. Happily, the city decided not to risk having it burnt down as Atlanta was. So Sherman was given this house to live in. And I read that there are notes that survived that he said, oh, it was a great place and was very comfortable. So this was Sherman's home at the time of the war when he was there. Lovely property adjoining the Episcopal Church. Again, I just love taking pictures of shadows, lights, and architecture. Another great house. They're not all museums, but many of them are just beautiful examples of architecture. Savannah became a wealthy city. But then after the Civil War in the 19th century, as people started to move out the suburbs, it did decline. And some of the squares were ripped up, and some of the good old buildings were torn down. But happily enough has survived. Now, an interesting aspect of Savannah architecture is that the basements are high. And you see many, many houses with the steps up to the main floor. I'm told the reason was that the streets were not paved. They were full of dust and dirt. So people didn't want their main floor close to the street. So you see many, many houses of various periods with steps leading up to the main part. And the lower floor is the raised basements. Very characteristic architecture. This is the Catholic Cathedral. I think it's called St. John the Baptist. Done in very beautiful form. It reminds me of St. Patrick's in New York, the double-spired Gothic architecture. I remember going to services here while I was there. I had good weather, as you can see, with the blue skies. This is the hotel, the DeSoto, where I stayed, a modern building, which replaced an old building, which I understand was a very great favorite in the South, the old DeSoto Hotel. A souvenir of that is the Terracina. Harriet Huston told me when this was being demolished, the original, she bought the drapes from the ballroom and brought them back and had them fitted, and we still have them in the 2 parlors at Terracina. So they're a little souvenir of Savannah right there. Well, I had an upstairs, upper floor room, which gave me great views of the city and certainly of the cathedral, which was close by. One morning I was up early just as the sun was rising. It's one of my favorite pictures with the crosses and in the growing light. Now nearby is this house known as the Low House, another well-to-do Savannah. And Andrew Lowe and his son married Juliet Gordon, and she lived there when she was married, and it was there that she created or formed the Girl Scouts organization. So it gets confusing. There's 2 houses connected with her. This is where she lived when she was married and where she formed the society. Harriet Huston told me that as a young woman, she went off on a trip to Europe with Juliet Lowe. And she was so active in all this. Again, some beautiful ironwork on this one side of that house. I'm endlessly fascinated with this ornamental ironwork. So I moved around and tried to get the ironwork and in between the two spires of the Catholic Cathedral. The green squares that are such a symbol of that city are really quite lovely. They continued it until about the 1860s. I think Gaston Street was about the last block of these things. This is Monterey Square. And it has the Jewish synagogue, mikvah, I think it's called, and a number of really great houses. Of various periods. This house in particular fascinated me. It was on a corner, and again I was impressed with the ornate ironwork, which, as you can see, runs all along the main floor. Just beautiful. Great houses. One of the wealthy early people named was Molyneux, and unless I'm confused, I think this became a law office, and I think Sam's office was in this, I'm not sure, in this firm. But I remember going into it. Very handsome neoclassical place. But now the house that everybody talks about and wants to see now in Savannah is this one, the Mercer House. And those of you who have read the book or seen the movie Midnight in the Garden of Evil, this is the Mercer House that's very prominent. It was not the home of Johnny Mercer, the songster, who was, I think, a descendant. It was built about 1860 for General Hugh Mercer. Very handsome house, as you can see. Later on, it belonged to a gentleman named James Williams. And this is all detailed in that book. A man named John Barrett, who spent time in Savannah and wrote the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Now, Mr. Williams owned a mudflat island somewhere along the river, which turned out to have a very valuable collection of minerals. And he sold it, made a lot of money, bought this house and restored it beautifully. He became active in civic affairs in Savannah, threw a great many parties. And while some of the older families looked down their nose at him as being nouveau riche, his comment was, "It's the riche that counts." He gave fabulous parties, and the movie brings it out very, very beautifully. And he had an upscale, very upscale antique business, which he ran from a building behind the house. Well, the notoriety came when he shot and killed someone here. He had a young chap who was something of a, ne'er-do-well, harem-scarum kid into drugs and fast cars and drugs, and he got into a heavy argument with Mr. Williams one night in the house, threatened him, and Williams shot him in self-defense. This became the celebrated case that's detailed. Williams eventually went to jail, he eventually got out, and then he died. But that adds a great deal to it. So this is the house that's so very much involved with that book. I found the movie fascinating with the depiction of Mr. Williams because during this trip I met Mr. Williams. This was long before the murder and the notoriety. But being interested in antiques and browsing around in antique shops, I found his shop and I went there. And he happened to be there. And he asked me what I was looking for. Well, as many of you know, I was heavily involved with Hibernia Mansion, trying to acquire things for it. We had furnishings, but we didn't have fittings. And I was looking for old silver, and I told him. And he said, "Well, I think I have something that might just be right for you. They're in the house. Come on ahead." So he took me into the house, and he had a pair of sort of Sheffield oval warming dishes with lion heads on the edge. And of course, lion head is the symbol of the park. And I acquired them and had him ship them up, and they are to this day still on the sideboard at Hibernia. It was fun. Then he said, "Would you like to see the house?" So he took me on a beautiful tour. It was gorgeous, gorgeous, the furnishing. I remember the next day I was having lunch with one of Mrs. Houston's son, Alex Can Sr., and he was, well, what did you do yesterday? What did you see? And so forth. So I told him. And I can remember Alex sort of stopped his fork in midair, and he said, "Oh my God, Gene, you know there are people who would kill in Savannah, who would kill to get in that house. And you ain't been here but 2 days and you got a private tour." Which I knew nothing about Williams. I just walked into it. But that's the Mercer House. Yeah. Well, nearby, a couple of blocks down the street, is this lovely Forsyth Park with a great fountain in the middle. And there we are. The fountain, I think, the pieces were made in Europe and brought here. And there you see more of the hanging moss that you see everywhere. Forsyth Park and the fountain. Nearby is the Georgia Historical Society in this old building, full of archival materials. But many great houses along Monterey Square, especially, I think, was attractive. But again, just walking through the houses that are ordinary, with the tones, the bricks, the vegetation, and again, the steps up to the main floor. Now, here is something that I stumbled on without knowing anything about it, and I learned later because I was making inquiries that this was one of Savannah's greatest landmarks. It's called the Scarborough House, and Scarborough was a wealthy merchant and one of the chief backers and financiers for the building of the steamship Savannah, the first steamship built across the country. And this was the Scarborough Mansion, also designed by this young architect, William J. I knew nothing about it. I saw it and I thought, God, this place is very impressive. It was going to ruin. But a few years later, it was taken over by a historic group who raised money, saved it. I understand now it's been gorgeously restored and is now a museum of shipping in Savannah. But this is the way it was when I saw it, run down, trash littered, and so forth. These pictures are kind of historic. And this was the back of it as I walked around and looked at it. Scarborough. Again, these lovely streets. You can understand why it's become such a tourist attraction.
Gene, how'd you get so many pictures without people in them?
I just shoo them away.
Reminds me, I think Forrest Gump was in that, in one of those park benches, and Forrest Gump, the movie, where he's waiting on the park bench all this time. And,
oh, Forrest Gump.
yeah, because I was sitting in the park and everybody came off a bus and they kept trying to take all these pictures of mine. The city didn't want to put a plaque on it though, because they just didn't want, I don't know, for some reason someone said they were complaining they didn't promote the movie, but.
Well, Forrest Gump was another Savannah character, wasn't he? And Mr. Barron's book sort of
I like that.
focuses on characters, doesn't it? Yes.
That is a great book.
Well, Midnight in the Garden of Evil, one of the things you have to do is take time to go look at Bonaventure Cemetery, which is a fascinating place, and Stuart Houston and his family are buried there, down there, full of great oak trees and hanging Spanish moss, and these Victorian funeral monuments. The famous statue that was featured on the dust jacket of the book showing this girl with her arms out, I understand had to be removed because the tourists were picking away at it. But this is very typical. A lot of movie. Reminded me of, it could be a setting for the famous ballet Giselle. But it was fascinating to hike through it. This was the entrance to a famous plantation called Wormslow. Not a museum, but this very typical long drive. I remember Mrs. Houston told me, don't miss this. Well, one evening, Mrs. Houston's son Alex and his delightful wife Mary took me to dinner down by the shore. I think it was called Tassie's Pier. And we saw shrimp boats. And you realize how important fishing is to the community. So with this picture, looking at water, I will conclude part one of this talk, Savannah.
long were you there, Gene?
About a week, I think, something like that. Well, while we're talking about Georgia, I threw these pictures in. Sometime in the 1990s, I had occasion to go down to Georgia. Flew down on a rather cloudy, overcast day, but I was amazed at how low the ground is and all this water. It's really some very, very valuable real estate on very low ground, and if the tides keep rising, I think I'd worry about owning them. I went down there at the invitation, or I should say the request of Lukens. Lukens management was having a board meeting, and it was not just a day's meeting, it was several days with management and talking about planning and future development and so forth. So I went down, and it was a rather elegant hotel called the Cloisters at Sea Isle. So I was asked to go down and do a talk on Lukens history. I was told there are new people who don't know the background, so I went down and had a chance to see this hotel. It was a heavy, hazy, humid day, but I looked around, and of course I did my duty. I did a luncheon talk and reception. Quite an impressive place, the Cloisters. And it was explained to me that if a major celebrity came, he was invited to plant an oak tree. So there's one that George Bush planted when he was visiting at one time, the first President Bush. This one was an oak tree that was planted by Calvin Coolidge. Somehow I can't see Calvin Coolidge at a posh resort, but he apparently went there. And this one turns you back to Savannah, this Uglethorpe oak. It was I think the sign said it was developed from acorns taken from his property in England. So I hiked around the property and I had some time. As I say, it was a very hazy, humid day. But interesting place and quite a nice setting. And I had then very late in the afternoon, I got back on the plane and came back to Coatesville. It was a pleasant, interesting trip. Well, knowing that I was going to be looking at endless buildings and architecture, I decided I needed to plan a relaxation in between two major cities. So I went down to Miami, and I went primarily to relax and enjoy the beach, and also to visit family. At that time, I had a lot of family there. I love this cloud picture. Those of you who have seen some of my previous pictures know that I'm always interested in clouds. If you look to the upper left, it looks like a face, frowning. No, it's not God. I didn't think it was, but it could be. I went to Miami. I didn't stay at Miami Beach. I went to Key Biscayne. I had family there and loved Key Biscayne. And I wasn't planning to do touring. I just wanted to relax and visit with the family. However, I did go to see one property called Vizcaya. This is one of the most dazzling properties in America, I think. There was a gentleman named Deering. James, I think, was his first name, made a fortune in industry. Collected all sorts of pieces, antiques, tiles from Cuban villages, tapestries, you name it. And about 1914, he constructed this house called Vizcaya. Now, this is Biscayne Bay. Biscayne Bay from Miami, the mainland, and the island. And there's the house. I purchased these slides. There's the house. That's the mainland behind him. And with this stone boat, which was sort of a landing. I was so fascinated with this that, yes, I gave up some other time on the beach. And I spent 3 trips over to see this place. Like Mr. DuPont at Longwood, he succeeded in developing and building what I think is hands down one of the finest examples of Italian Renaissance gardens in America. I was fascinated with the place, just as I am with Longwood. and meandered all over it on several days. He did a great deal of careful planning in the gardens. They fan out from the house, and there's a casino at the far end. Amusingly, while I was preparing for this talk, I pulled down a book devoted to historic properties, and this was in it, and as well as some others. And a note fell out, and it was a note from Stuart Huston. I had loaned him the book, apparently, so he wrote back on the note thanking me for the loan and told me that he and Mrs. Huston had toured this particular property. It's breathtaking. It later became the property of Dade County, which is where Miami is. This was the entranceway. I think now it's owned by a private 501 museum group. He collected furniture, chandeliers, tapestries, had a massive amount of things. Of course, today with the restrictions, you can't take things out of Europe the way they did in his time. But it's just an endlessly fascinating house. The dining room, I think the Medici would have been happy with it. This Italianate architecture. And the swimming pool, which you could come into from outside, but then it went extended outside. Quite a pool. I took a lot of garden pictures, and again, I'm fascinated with lights and shadows and just an urn. Very classical. I had beautiful weather. Vizcaya is the Spanish form. Biscayne in B and V are interchangeable in Spanish. I love some of the details in the gardens, like this little frog climbing up on that and spouting. Reminded me of the frogs at Longwood. Many, many fountains. So there it is, Vizcaya. Beautiful summer place, or winter place. Of course, was not there in the summer. Well, just to prove to you that I did spend some time on the beach, you can see I'm getting tan. Didn't spend all of it in the House Museum. This was taken one evening at one of my cousins' home. And here I'm even darker. These were children of one of my cousins, two little doll babies really, and I enjoyed very much time with them. But you can see I'm getting darker and darker. So there they are. Well, time to go back, and I got on the train in Miami to go up to Charleston. And it was a daylight ride. The countryside is not terribly exciting. Of course, in the old days, if you went to Florida on the Atlantic coastline, you would hook up with the Florida East Coast Railroad at Jacksonville, which did follow the coast. But later on, they had a horrible, endless strike, which practically ended passenger service on that line. So they now use the Seaboard airline, which much of it is inland. It doesn't come out to the coast until north of Palm Beach. On an adjoining track at one of the stations was this group of business cars with a back porch, which I imagine management was out taking a look at the line. I had a very comfortable car that I was riding in this, a little shadowy, but it was a pleasant car. But we had a little something special to see. They had a real train wreck just a few days before, and anxious to clear their single track line, they had pushed everything into a creek, and as you can see, this was quite a wreck. Little diversion on the way up. They do go over sometimes. Yes, Atlantic coastline, in the coast. But it was a pleasant ride. Some of the stations were really small little stations in Florida. I like this, one of those old-time baggage carts, which you don't see very much anymore. Little boy fascinated with it and talking to the porter and one of the train people. That's a rarity. They used to be very common, those baggage carts. Well, I got to Charleston and I stayed at this hotel. It was called the Mills House, which turned out to be an absolute delightful place to be. I understand that early on in the 19th century, there was a large hotel, about the same number of floors on this site. And they would hope to preserve it, but it was decided it just was too much, so it was demolished, and the new hotel built on the same site. Utilizing much of the same architecture and some of the fragments, including all this beautiful ironworks. So this was the Mills House, which I stayed the week I spent in Charleston. I thought it was just beautifully done, beautifully done. Courtyard, fountain, nice food. I had a nice room on an upper floor with a window which gave this view. And what you see there is the tower of St. Michael's Church, one of Charleston's chief ornamental architectures, sort of a symbol of the city. And I loved looking at this from my window. There's another great cloud effect. Again, clouds can be dramatic. As I said at the beginning of the talk, here are two cities that have really profited from historic preservation. Right down the street from the hotel was an eye-catching building called Hibernia Hall. And as I learned, it was the headquarters of some sort of Irish social. An old building, and to make it more interesting, designed by Thomas U. Walter, the architect who did our buildings in Westchester and associated with Chester County, with these wonderful gas lights, which fascinated me. A classical building. And it had a rotunda, and the chandelier caught my eye with the harps on the detail. Again, a cloudy day, but sort of dramatic. This building is called I believe it's called the Fireproof. It was built, I think, by, 1840s, and still is used to hold archives and records. Nearby is the City Hall with these very interesting round windows with the ironwork for them. Designed by Gabriel Manigault. And one of the names that you do encounter frequently is Manigault, who was an architect and designed a number of famous buildings there. Beautiful classical building. With the Palmetto flag flying. Again, the Fireproof building. These are right down the main street called Meeting Street, which is very, very prominent. And we're going to take a look at St. Michael's. This is really, truly beautiful. It was right down the street from the hotel. I saw it every day. Never tired of looking at it. For me, a good piece of architecture is as good as a piece of sculpture. And I love this church. Gates along the side that led into an old cemetery. I took a view of the cemetery through a church window. I believe this is the oldest standing church in Charleston, and certainly one of the most beautiful. And the vegetation down there, of course, is lovely. South Meeting Street, the building on the left is the Scottish Church, Presbyterian, I think. Quite a handsome, dramatic building. And again, it's a feast for the eyes to look at these old houses. Not all of them are museums, very few are. And of course, real estate in downtown Charleston, I understand, is really through the roof. Very expensive. Many people want to be there. The ambience, the city, the brick walks, and so forth. You just soak it all up and enjoy the settings of it. This was a church built like a Greek temple, but it was a church. I've forgotten which one. Very handsome. And again, just walking the streets. Now here we come to one of the most famous houses in the South, the Nathaniel Russell House. He was a prosperous merchant, built this house in very classic Georgian style. It's considered one of the most beautiful houses in the South. Harriet Houston used to talk to me about it. She grew up in Charleston and told me she lived just a few doors up the street from it. Don't miss it, Eugene, don't miss it. And she was right. It was quite beautiful. I understand it was built for the grand sum of $80,000 in the early 1800s. The interiors were very graceful, high ceilings, very classic. Again, some slides that I purchased when I was there. This is what I call very elegant in a subdued classic way. The second floor had this lovely parlor. And that was a favorite picture of mine with the shadowing of that railing around the outside. And one of the most famous features is this staircase. It's freestanding. It's not cantilevered from the wall. It's freestanding. A marvelous piece of carpentry, how it's all put together, but it's one of the great features of the house. This is the dining room to the rear of the house, with a door that leads out to the garden. Nathaniel Russell. There's two organizations, I guess they're still there. One was the Preservation Society, which fought for preservation, and then Historic Charleston, Inc., and they are more of a museum operation, and as far as I know, they still own this house. One person that I became happily acquainted with was this lady who had been for many years the key guiding force of the Preservation Society, Mrs. Van Noy Thornhill. And she was just great and actually spent a lot of time with me. I was thrilled that she spent time with me going around the city. This is part of the garden of the Nathaniel House. This building is the headquarters of the Charleston Society, no, Carolina Society, I think it is. And there is an organization called the Cecilia Society, which is a high-toned social group, very much like the Assembly in Philadelphia. You have to have the correct ancestry to get to be a member, but it's much sought after. And again, I love this staircase with the lanterns. I walked by this building several times. Looking up the stair towards the church. This was one of my favorite buildings in Charleston. Now this house is often pops up in books. It's considered a classic example of classical architecture, the pediments and so forth. It's not a museum, as far as I know, still a private home. Samuel Chamberlain, who did a lot of wonderful books on architecture and sites in New England and the South, featured this house in his book on Charleston interiors, rhapsodized over it, and it is quite beautiful. All that classical carving, the Doric pediments and so forth. Another famous house in Charleston is this, the Miles Bruton. It dates back to I think the mid-18th century. It was built by a wealthy gentleman, and not long after he built it, he and his family were lost in a shipwreck at sea. So it went to a sister who lived there, and I understand at the time of the Revolutionary War, it was occupied by the British General Clinton, and she had young daughters, and she locked them in the attic to make sure there'd be no problems. And interesting, but it's a beautiful, beautiful property. I've heard this may become a museum. It may have. It's been a while since I've been down there. The Miles Bruton House. Beautiful ironwork, beautiful lanterns. Well, one of the things you have to do is go out to see Fort Sumter. So one nice sunny day, I got in the boat and went out to see the fort. And there it is. It stands, if you look at the map, you see Charleston's sort of a peninsula, and there's rivers on either side, the Ashley and the Cooper. And old Charlestonians will say, yes, we're located where the Ashley and the Cooper rivers join to form the Atlantic Ocean. That's a no typical joke, but I had to see Sumter, and out we went. This, of course, is where the war began, when the Confederacy got formed, and they asked the garrison, and they said no. So the firing on Fort Sumter in, I think it was mid-April of 1861, was really where the hostilities began. And of course, the Confederates battered it pretty bad, and the U.S. Forces surrendered it. And the Confederates held it until sometime, I think 1864. It was pretty well battered. A great deal of it was a ruin, and much of it still is, or was when I was there. But if you're interested in Civil War history, this is a must-see. And my friend, Mrs. Thornhill, said, yes, you Yankees all got to go look at that. She was great. So I went out and toured it, and yeah, it is. It's a major landmark, no question about it. And it's at the mouth of the harbor. You can see why it was such an important military post. While I was there, I picked up, moment change here. I picked up a booklet that was a reprint of a booklet published in 1861 by the local people. And the title was Our First Victory. Our First Victory. The Confederates. Come on, find it. Oh, there were times when I thought the war wasn't quite over. Mrs. Thornhill, who was just marvelous, but she was gracious to me, and one day she invited me to cocktails at her home. She lived in the Battery, and I was trying to mind my Yankee manners and not say Civil War, and referred to it as the war between the states. She went me one better and called it the War of Northern Aggression, which I understand is quite common. The War of Northern Aggression. But there it is.
Gene, is the destruction left from the...
Pardon?
The destruction, is that from the Civil War that we see?
Most
there?
of it is. Some of it was rebuilt, some of it was not, was what I was told. Oh yes, it was heavily battered. And of course, we battered it again when we were trying to take it back. There are gun placements here and there. I don't know what their pounders were, but they were certainly very heavy. And I didn't understand clearly whether these were brought there or whether they were actually relics from the fort when it was there, but you can see a number of guns from the period in Sumter. Looking through one of the gun ports. So that's Fort Sumter, very commanding position. And you can see why it was such a desirable conquest by the Confederate Army. Well, the harbor is still very heavily used. It's a busy port. And there you see the city. You can see a couple of the church skyscrapers, as they call them, and the houses along the Battery. We came back and docked here. This was a rice mill. Now, you know, of course, that rice was a major crop in this area, and one of the chief exports. And the rice was processed in mills. This is one of the mills that has survived. Well, the Battery has beautiful park area. And of course, unlike Savannah, which is miles from the ocean, this is right there. So there's a lot of breezes. This is the Battery Park, a monument to the war, our valiant Southern heroes with the Victory Shield. Well, I'm told that to have a house on the Battery is a great social distinction, indicates how well off you are, and it is lined with some very great grand houses. Now, one of the architectural interesting things of Charleston is that it was highly desirable to have a house in Charleston, especially near the waterfront. So the land parcels were very narrow. So the houses are narrow. And the ends of them are what face the front. And any number of these houses can be seen. Long porches, verandas to catch the ocean breezes. I walked up and down the Battery a number of times. This house intrigued me. This must have been early 1900s from the architecture. It's not typical grandeur of the past. But very often the house, what we would consider the end of the house, was what faced the street, and then it would be lengthy to the back with these porches and with the door on the lower level, which is how you got into the property. Very typical architecture there. You wanted to catch the ocean breezes, so those verandas were enormously popular. Yes, if you go to Charleston, you must take the time to walk the Battery. A less grand house, but I love the color. And there's the door, which led into the house and the garden. One of the grandest houses on the Battery is this one called the Roper House. As far as I know, still privately owned. Very grand place. Again, the end facing the street, but with a great colonnade. The Roper House. This house particularly delighted me. I love this gray color. And with a brick wall, which was partially red and partially discolored. Somehow, you know, some properties hit you and others don't, but this one I took several pictures of it. And believe me, you're seeing less than half of the pictures I took here in Charleston. Absolutely loved it. Now, one of the streets there is called Legree Street. It's spelled L-E-G-A-R-E, but they pronounce it Legree. And my friend there, Mrs. Thornhill, lived on Legree Street and very kindly showed me her property. One of the landmarks is this gate to one of the houses. It's called the Sword Gate. And you see pictures of this on booklets on Charleston. and that was beyond the gate in the house itself. This is this big classical building is the United States Customs House. I think it was designed by Strickland, who also did the Tennessee State Capitol. That's a street line or something in front of it. Now this is Broad Street, which is sort of the main commercial street, or was at one time. And a lot of years ago, there was an enormous amount of fussing in Charleston. They wanted to knock all this down, put up some modern buildings, but again, the preservationists won, and I don't think too much of it was lost. That's Broad Street, a business section of the street. This, I think, is the Rhett House. I've often thought that Margaret Mitchell, when she wrote her famous book, Gone with the Wind, picked up some of the character names from families. I mean, there was Rhett Butler, and this is a Rhett, R-H-E-T-T, family. Another example of gorgeous ironwork on this house. Beautifully maintained, has to be, to continue supportive. Now, another very famous house is this Haywood, Washington house. A very prominent, wealthy owner built this. And he was, I think, one of the signers of the Declaration. And it got the name Washington because in 1791, when President George Washington came here, he stayed in this house. Rather handsome Georgian opening, parlor. And this piece, this is hands down the most impressive piece of furniture I saw in Charleston. It was explained to me that this was made by Charleston cabinet makers, and yes, they regard it very highly as a superb example of talent, and it is. It's amazing the furniture that was produced by individual cabinet makers. This was in the kitchen, the scullery, and a little garden to the back of it. Yes, this is another do not miss house if you do go there. Now this is interesting. This row had come to be very derelict, but it was made into little shops. And it's called Catfish Row. And if you've ever read the play or seen George Gershwin's opera, Porgy and Bess, this is sort of the home for it. It was mentioned, Catfish Row. Rather tony little shops now. It doesn't evoke the play at all, really. Well, this was the old market house. Again, another classical building. Ironwork. And the actual market behind it. I think it's still used at times for marketing. And yes, I was told it was the center of the slave trade in the days of slavery. Well, the other great church with a tower is St. Philip's, which you see here with its great tower and columns. It and St. Michael's, I think, are the two most outstanding churches in the whole city, and both very beautiful. I like this, the spire with the ornamental ironwork in the foreground. Well, one last reel. I don't remember the name of this house, but another very handsome Georgian affair. This is the beautiful fan light at the top, the brick. There was obviously a lot of money in Charleston in the heyday of the 18th and 19th century, which produced these gorgeous pieces of architecture. And this was a later house, a very grand one, not a museum, but of course I was fascinated with the classical building. This is a school. This was a private mansion. I think it was called Ashley, and it later became a girls' school. But the house, which was the center of it, was open and you could go to see it. Again, another spectacular staircase. And I took that looking all the way up to the top. I think you'd get exhausted climbing these things, but Charleston has a number of these spectacular staircases. Very pleasant grounds. Well, one of the things that Mrs. Thornhill took me to, this is the Citadel. It was originally an arsenal, and then it became a boys' military school. Quite famous, the Citadel. And during the Civil War, a lot of the students there were involved in the war. However, they outgrew this property, and I think it's an offices now. And they eventually moved the whole school from downtown. There you see the Palmetto flag on the right. They eventually moved it to a whole new campus uptown, and Mrs. Thornhill took me to see that. And it was really very beautiful. But they, in building the new school, they kept much of the architectural design from the old one downtown. And this is the new Citadel school. Very handsome, very beautiful.
That's a military school, huh?
Yes, yes it is. It's like Valley Forge, that sort of thing. That's the chapel. Now, another major thing is the Charleston City College, and this is the entrance gateway to it. Right from the street, and from that led you into the campus grounds. Strickland, I believe, was the architect for the main building. Mrs. Thornhill, in her position as president of the Preservation Society, had been through a major fight with the school. They wanted to tear down some old buildings and expand the campus. The sort of fight that's going on now at Princeton when the Advanced Study Group wants to build on the site of the Battle of Princeton. But she apparently won. And while we were there, she took me to meet the president of the school, who was really, really very polite to her. I think he met his match, and they did preserve what they wanted to keep. This is the, I think that they said it was the oldest city college in America, the Charleston School, which I could well believe. And when that terrible shooting occurred down here several months ago, it was in this neighborhood, and I recognized when they told where it was. Not on this campus, but in this area. Now, this is another gatehouse which leads into one of the most famous buildings in Charleston. And again, you hear the word Manigault. And Gabriel Manigault designed this house for his brother, Joseph. The Manigault house is uptown, far away from the Battery, and I understand had become very derelict, but a group of people worked together to save it, and it's now a museum, and that's the gateway from the house. The Manigault. And I'm sure it's more handsomely restored now than it was when I was there. Happily was saved. It came close to being destroyed. That's the entrance hall with another very beautiful staircase. And they acquired a handsome crystal chandelier. The portrait is of the mother of the two brothers, Joseph and Gabriel Manigault. Now, I call your attention to this bed. Something that's common there are what are called rice beds. Because rice was such a prominent thing, they sometimes did carvings, and you can see it on the posts, of what look like the grains of rice. And they are known as rice beds. The dining room, again, I'm always impressed with dining rooms. So that was the Manigault house. Well, with happy memories of looking at all these beautiful houses and their textures and tones, I left Charleston with a head full of just very happy images. Now, just going back for a minute to the trip I made to the cloisters, I came back on the Lukens plane, and one of the pilots said, "Gene, we're going to fly right over Charleston." I said, "Oh, I want to see it." So he brought me up front, dipped the wings, and I got this shot. I later sent a print of this to my friend. I said, "I was just 4 miles from your house, but straight up in the air." Well, we came back to Coatesville, and you'll recognize our landmarks there. Usually when the planes came in to our airport, I understand, almost came in, always from the south, so you'd get a good view of the open hearths and the buildings and so forth, and the railroad bridge. Now that, of course, is Greystone Mansion. I brought you back to Coatesville. The whole idea of this talk this evening was to tie these things in with Coatesville. And I'm going to divert just a few minutes to talk to you about Greystone and its architectural importance. The house was built in 1889 by Abram Francis Huston, who happily employed a very talented architectural firm, Cope and Stewardson, to design this, who also did this building, by the way. Well, these two young men who had studied abroad and traveled abroad were very impressed with things that they saw at Cambridge and Oxford universities. So after they went to create their own firm, Cope and Stewardson, in the mid-1880s, some of their earliest commissions were for schools. And they did a dormitory at Bryn Mawr and then 2 or 3 other buildings. And in designing those buildings, they incorporated ideas and designs from what they saw in Europe. Some people would say they copied. I say no, they adapted. Well, what they did at Bryn Mawr was quite successful, so much so that Penn later had them design the dormitories at the University of Pennsylvania. Most famously, Princeton in the 1890s had them design a dormitory called Blair Hall, and later some other buildings. And what they did at Princeton became, I would say, sort of the hallmarks of their style. Now, while I'm telling you all this is because while the house, of course, is important with our local history and the Huston family, it has a special place in American architectural history. Cope and Stewardson became known as the creators of this so-called American collegiate Gothic style of architecture, which was, as I say, Bryn Mawr, Penn, Princeton, and Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. But many other architects and many other schools used that style of architecture. And when the Coatesville Historical Commission, back in the 1960s, this is before Greystone Society existed, nominated this for the National Register, the National Park Service eventually said yes, because very clearly it could be seen as a step in the development of the style for which these people became famous and which was so widely imitated. So we have, you know, a real nationally important building here. Now, I'm going to close the show by taking you to North Carolina to show you an example of collegiate Gothic architecture, which was inspired by this whole collegiate style. This is Duke University in Durham. One of the finest examples that I know of collegiate Gothic architecture, and a whole campus was done this. Now this goes back to the Duke family of the wealthy tobacco fortune who lived in North Jersey, and they knew and loved Princeton. So when they decided to do this, they wanted it to look like Princeton. Cope and Stewardson were of course long dead, and so they went to another Philadelphia firm, Trumbauer. So the firm of Horace Trumbauer did practically all of this original campus, and it is quite breathtaking. These pictures were taken
On that, Gene. When were they actually built?
the 20s and 30s. Yeah.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh yeah. They did local stone. It was too expensive to ship down gray stone like is at Princeton. Princeton was so intrigued with it that after the first buildings in the 1890s, everything until the Second World War was built in collegiate Gothic. Other architects, because as I say, Cope and Stewardson were gone. Then after the war, they built some god-awful modern stuff. But a few years ago, they went back and built a whole huge dormitory complex in this style that it cost us something like $100 million over at Princeton. Now, I should explain that this was not a trip originally planned just to go here. In 2008, I was on a swing through the Upper South. I had gone to Cincinnati, I had gone to Nashville, Tennessee, and I was going to Richmond, Virginia. So in between, I went to this area primarily to visit with an old friend. I have a longtime friend, a college classmate, who, when he retired from working, he and his wife sold their home in Pennsylvania and moved to a town not too far from this called Pinehurst. Now, those of you who are golfers will recognize Pinehurst. Well, Bob is one of my oldest and closest friends. He'd been wanting me to visit, so since I was in the area, we did it. I flew from Nashville to the airport at Durham and spent a very happy week with Bob and his wife in their home at Pinehurst. So one day Bob said, let's go over there. So we got in his car and we drove over to look at Duke University campus. It is really spectacular. I took a lot of pictures. I had been there once before a number of years ago, and this was sort of a refresher course. But you can see the application of the collegiate Gothic style, and it makes us proud that here in Coatesville we have a house which was really a beginning of that whole style. Dominant on the campus is this great tower. When you drive up, it's the first thing you see, and it's really beautiful, beautiful. And there's a statue of Mr. Duke standing in front of it, looking like he just stepped out of the boardroom after an extra dividend declaring, but it's very handsome. Well, I did spend time at Pinehurst, and I'll close with a few pictures here. Pinehurst has a very interesting history. A gentleman named Tufts, T-U-F-T-S, was a philanthropist, and this whole thing was his dream. He had this dream of creating a special resort. He bought something like 5,000 or 6,000 acres of timberland, pine land that had been burned off for the turpentine, and he proceeded to develop it in the 1890s and built hotels, and eventually golf got established here a few years later. The hotel is really a grand old affair. We went there a few times, but I was a house guest at my friend's, so I didn't stay here. But this is the hotel, the Grand Hotel at Pinehurst. Quite a resort.
Reminds me of Flanders a little bit in Ocean City, New Jersey.
This is my friend. His name is Gable, Robert Gable. We were classmates at Villanova. Got acquainted in the fall of our freshman year and became friends, and although we had very, very different interests, we became close friends and still are. So Bob made sure that I saw the town. Pinehurst is a charming town. A lot of wealthy people there, a lot of beautiful homes. And of course, all of it surrounding on the golf course. And Bob knows that I have no interest in golf, but he did his best. This was the library, and a rear section of the library had a small museum devoted to the history of Pinehurst. I was very impressed. Things with Mr. Tufts, he had a corporation that made soda fountains and things like that for restaurants, made a fortune with it, and I was very impressed with the whole display. It reminded me of the time when we in the Greystone Society were getting started and wanted to put together a small history of Coatesville over at City Hall. It was beautifully done. But it was a lovely area, and of course the pine trees are everything down there. Pinehurst is charming, but if you're not into golf, beyond it is just typical pine trees and poverty. Some rather poor areas around it, but the town itself is charming. Well, we traveled around, Bob, and this is the Southern Pine Station, and going south, and some of the trains stop here. There is no track into Pinehurst itself. But Bob drove me around and make sure I saw all the courses. There's something like 8, as I remember. The number 2 being the most famous one, where the Opens have been held several times. Mr. Tuff brought in Olmsted, a landscape architect, to do this, do the original landscaping. And then there was a gentleman from Scotland, I think his name was Ross, who was associated with Pinehurst for decades. And he is considered one of the most successful and most famous designers of golf courses. And he worked there. My friend moved to Pinehurst so that he could golf all year round. He said, I don't want Florida, it's too hot. So he says, here, you know, I can golf all year round. And I said, well, there's nothing left for you but heaven. And his comment was, well, they better be good there too. Just a few snaps I took of golf courses. And of course, he did his best to indoctrinate me in the importance of golf there. This is Bob. He has quite a collection of golf memorabilia in his home, and also sometimes deals with it. Well, that's Bob and his delightful wife, Barbara, and they were just wonderful. It was wonderful to spend the time with them. And of course, he did that with me. Now, there's a tradition in shows that should always leave them laughing. So the last picture is something that Bob insisted on. Insisted on my getting in a golf course, put a club in my hand, and he said, nobody is going to believe this. Nobody is going to believe that. But that was his picture, and I love it. He was a great, good friend. Well, that concludes the talk this evening. And I'd like to say a few words at the end, if I may. And let me get the other. Yeah, you can put the light on, please. Many of you have been to many of these travel lectures over the years, and I am appreciative of the support and interest that you've shown. This is quite possibly the last travel lecture I'm going to do. Getting old and deciding what to do with things, I am in the process of disposing of my entire photo collection. Much of it's coming here, of course. Anything that relates to the Steel Museum and the buildings is staying here. And a lot of other things have gone to the Chester County Historical Society. But I'm happy to report, as some of you know, that I have found a happy place for most of my photo collections, going to Longwood Gardens. Some years ago, the education staff at Longwood found out that I had taken pictures in the late 1950s, early 1960s, when Longwood was going through a transitional period after Mr. DuPont's death. And they did not have some of the shots that I had. So I gave them initially over 1,000 black and white negatives, which they scanned. And one thing led to another, and then Longwood staff indicated they'd like to have my whole collection, since much of it is architecture, buildings, gardens, and so forth. So it's a very happy decision, and I agreed to give it to them. Longwood is very close, and of course I love the place. And Longwood has what I wanted for wherever I gave it. They've got wonderful facilities. I'm happy to know that my pictures are safe in the vaults at Longwood. And they have the staff and the funding. But beyond all that, there's the thought that they will be using it. They're waiting for me to get most of the slides there, and they're going to digitize the whole thing and scan them, so they will be available to people. This is what I wanted. I didn't want to give the things to a museum or just sat in a shelf somewhere. So because I've already given over 15,000 slides to Longwood, and probably another 5,000 or 6,000 to go, then I have to start on the black and white negatives, of which there are 40 or 50,000. So it's going to take quite a lot. And of course, as I give it to Longwood, I give them a listing and so forth. But I'm happy that so many of you have been faithful to come to my lectures. And I just feel that this is probably the last one we're going to do, because I'm disposing of the collection. So thank you all again for coming this evening.